Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic is grief, how to manage and deal with loss in a healthy way and really come to terms with a loss, a death, and really grow from it as well. My guest is grief counselor Gina Moffa, author of the book Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, a modern guide to navigating loss. Gina, thank you so much for being with us today to discuss this very important topic.
Thank you, Lori. It's so great to be here with you and everyone.
When we talk about grief, the first thing that comes to mind for most of us is the death of a loved one. But really, there are so many different types of grief that you bring out in your book. Divorce, the loss of a pet, the loss of a job, even things like losing your identity, such as like moving from your home to maybe a nursing facility, which is a loss of a very important loss as well. But they say sometimes that the loss of a loved one is the most stressful and traumatic thing a person can experience. Do you agree with that?
I think truly that we are the captain of our ships when it comes to loss. And so anything that we lose, which is really significant to us, is pretty much the most important loss there is. You know, of course, if you go through the sickness and the illness of a loved one and then they pass, that is obviously incredibly traumatic. But I think we get to determine what feels the most important when it comes to losses. You know, sometimes people lose a pet, and that is as close a family member as they have. And society doesn't always deem it as important. So I really wrote this book to validate that any important loss to you is important, and your loss will always be the most important loss.
And really one thing that I loved about your book was you talked about this feeling right after the initial loss and how important that is. And you're sort of falling, I think you call it grief fall.
To me, it is a moment that we can all identify and relate to. It's the portal to grieving, in my opinion. It's that moment we get the phone call with the news of our loved one's death. It is the diagnosis. It is the moment that our life will be forever shifted in some way. And we're not exactly grieving yet, but we're on our way there. It's that sudden free fall that we all feel, where we don't know where we're going to land. Everything feels like it will never be the same, and it can be incredibly disorienting. And I gave it a name because so many people that come to see me are like, I don't know exactly how I feel. I don't feel like I'm in grief yet, but I'm still in a state of shock. And that fresh grief to me is really the start of that grief fall.
And how long does that usually last? Let's say if you are grieving the loss of a loved one, let's say it was a sudden loss of a loved one. In other words, hadn't been sick for a while, and or they were not really that old. They sort of suddenly died. How long does a grief fall last, sort of depending on the type of death?
The grief fall is really just a moment, right? If you have a sudden loss or an unexpected loss of any kind, there's going to be more of a trauma reaction involved, right? There's that suddenness is going to take our breath away. We're not going to know what to do, and our nervous system will respond first and foremost. But the grief fall can really last as long as, you know, we are in a state of shock, so to speak. It is that one moment that will introduce us to a new life. And so to me, it really is just that doorway. And it will take as long as it may take for it to settle in that things are changing for you and that, you know, your life will never be the same. And it's complicated, it's individual. But it can be, especially what you were just saying, you know, after a sudden loss or a shock, that grief fall can be something that stays with us for a long period of time because we're still in that fall. It doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like something we can grasp. It certainly doesn't feel like something we're ready to process or really experience fully yet. So it really can be incredibly challenging, especially during that fresh grief period.
So as a grief counselor, what do you tell somebody who's feeling, you know, lost and confused? And they say that, you know, they use those words. I feel lost. I feel confused. I don't know how to move on without this person.
Well, I never ask anyone to move on. You know, and that's actually part of the title of my book too, because so many people do come to me and they say, I know it's been a week, it's been 2 weeks, it's been 5 weeks, I've got to move on. But I'm still so confused. I still feel so lost. And the truth is that it's going to take really quite a while for our brains to wrap around this new reality. And so for me, I always say the first thing is to feel safe, right? When we lose someone, everything comes into question. We don't feel safe in the world anymore. We don't know who we are. We don't know how we're supposed to get on with the person if we're talking about the death of a loved one, depending on if we were their caretaker or they were caretaking us in some capacity. So I think the relationship really matters. But I do think that, this is a time in our lives where we have to, get back to basics. We're always looking for more complicated solutions to things. But so many people will come to me and they haven't eaten all day, or they haven't slept in weeks, or, they haven't been outside or connected with nature or had a chance to pray or meditate or really center themselves. And so I really do like to get people as quickly as I can back to basics and make sure that they're drinking enough water, they're getting movement, they're getting enough rest. And because we can't endure grief, which is an incredibly long experience, but grief is a physical, full body experience as well. And how can we actually endure that if we are completely depleted at all cost? And so I really like to encourage people as best they can to manage their expectations in the beginning of a loss and really keep it at the basics, making sure that they're just getting enough of their basic needs met.
Well, you talk about the physical response to grief. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And also, when you talk about taking care of yourself, this is probably another separate question. People oftentimes don't feel like taking care of themselves. They don't feel like exercising, and they also probably would like to drink a lot of alcohol or eat a lot of junk food and just engage in a lot of maybe even substance abuse, take drugs or whatnot. That makes them feel better in the moment. So can you talk about all these, how that would affect your body as well?
Absolutely. Well, stress itself links the physical aspects of grief to the emotional aspects of grief. Of course, we don't always want to be feeling that, intense, turbulent emotion of sadness or anger or whatever the unpredictable feelings can be. But numbing ourselves only lasts for so long. And so, although I can understand it, right, it's always what other choices can we add in? If you have to have alcohol to numb your feelings right now, maybe you can also reach out to a friend. Maybe if you don't want to exercise, you can also just take a walk around the neighborhood, even take a walk around your house. If you don't want to connect with people, maybe you can look outside of your window and feel connected. It's just about the baby steps of being able to do things. I think it's really normal in those very beginning stages of loss to want to stay in bed or want to isolate or, want to not take care of our bodies. And that's certainly understandable. And it's okay to distract ourselves. It's okay to numb ourselves temporarily. But I want to say that if it does continue, and sometimes it does, this is when we get into a territory of prolonged grief and complicated grief, because then we sit and we ruminate over our experience and we're not actually allowing ourselves to feel our feelings or to experience whatever it is grief related that we really need to be experiencing. And it can be incredibly isolating. And so, though it is understandable, I always say, if you must do that, let's add in something healthy. Let's add in something that keeps you connected. Because one of the toughest things about grief and loss is that it isolates us inherently. And so when we disconnect in other ways, it makes that so much harder, so much more challenging to get through. And so, it's obviously incredibly normal to want to do these things, but I say, let's, as best we can, at least stay connected. Let someone know how you're feeling, reach out to at least one person that you can trust, that keeps you connected and that can watch over you and make sure that you're also doing things that are at least a little bit healthy.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and be right back with Gina Moffa. The book is called Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, a modern guide to navigating loss. Stay with us.
Stay connected with CBN News all day across our platforms.
Welcome back to Healthy Living. We are continuing our discussion with Gina Moffa, author of the book Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, a modern guide to navigating loss. So right before the break, Gina, you were talking about it's perfectly normal to sort of turn to substances to numb the pain of a loss, like food or alcohol. There are so many different things, but that you need to try to minimize that and then stop doing that after a certain period of time. What period of time is that? What's the time limit that you realize you need to start getting dressed and taking a shot and starting to get back into the land of the living?
Absolutely. I absolutely also do not recommend heavily drinking and eating too much sugar. It is understandable that humans have not necessarily been taught to feel their emotions or given a lot of permission to feel badly. And so because we feel like we have to grieve quickly, some people only have 3 days bereavement leave, for example, there's that, there's an indication that we really have to hurry up the process. And so with that fear, a lot of people then feel like they may have to numb with substances or overeating or anything that feels comforting in the moment. I would say that I don't necessarily give it a time limit per se, but I think that we all know when we're doing something to escape a feeling. I think we all understand when we're doing something that perhaps is destructive to us in our bodies and we shouldn't be doing it. And so I say it's understandable. I do not recommend it. But I understand that there are going to be maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, where you are trying to just take in the reality while you're still perhaps in that grief fall and you're in that state of shock and your nervous system may be completely on overdrive and you may be in fight or flight, as we say. And so you may need things that can take it down a little. This is where I normally would say this is the time to reach out to a professional. This may be a time if you're not able to get out of bed and you're over drinking too much, to reach out to someone you trust and say, hey, this has been really hard. And, I'm not able to actually feel what I feel, or I'm not able to take care of myself right now. Or you may actually have somebody say that to you. I'm really sorry. I see that you're drinking too much. What's going on? And so I think that there's not necessarily a time period per se, but we all have that, timeline of when we think that we actually have to start getting back to taking care of ourselves. It doesn't mean that we're letting our loss go by the wayside or our grief by the wayside. In fact, quite the opposite. We're taking that with us and we're actually going to start to experience what we need to experience, which is feeling our feelings or, acknowledging the physical aspects of grieving. It can even be creating new rituals and how terrifying that is, or setting up new routines, which is also, these are really difficult things when grieving. So it is understandable to want to numb, but I do believe that, being disconnected first and foremost is at the root of that. And having connection of any kind that feels important, trustworthy, and safe to you is going to be the biggest benefit that you can give yourself in the grief process.
So let's say somebody who is going through grief, who lost someone very important to them, and how do you reach out to them to try to help them? What are the types of things you should say and do? And then also, what are the things that you should avoid? I noticed you spent a lot of time talking about platitudes in your book, things not to say, like heaven needed another angel, things like that.
Yeah, we mean well as a society, but I imagine you'll agree that we're not incredibly grief literate. We do try to make things a little bit easier, and everyone has a different belief system. And so it's really at times very difficult to know what is going to hit somebody in just the right way that can be comforting and help them feel connected. When it came to heaven has another angle, one of my clients, as I talk about in the book, it was given in social media and nobody even took the time to spell check. So it was heaven had another angle. And I think that sometimes happens, right? That we want to get something out there, but it may not necessarily be so heartfelt as much as the anxiety of saying something. And so my recommendation is really to show up as you. What would you say to this person if you're a close friend? Somebody who's going through major loss already feels like they've been transported to another planet. Everything feels new. Everything feels perhaps scary, but it feels different. And so the comfort that we can get as grievers is knowing that somebody that we love can show up as them. If they show up and say things that they would not normally say to us, it further, concretizes the fact that we are in a different world and nothing feels familiar. So, I don't have necessarily a problem with a platitude if it's rooted in something that can connect you to the person who's grieving. But, it's enough to say, I see you. This really is horrible. I'm so sorry for your loss, as opposed to either saying nothing or showing up with something that could never touch them because it doesn't actually symbolize the closeness or the relationship that you have. I'm a big proponent of doing things in a concrete way and tangible way if you can show up with food, if you know they have children and they may need help with something, showing up in some way. But grievers don't know what they need a lot of the time, and our needs change as grievers. And so it's really hard when you reach out, even in a way that's meaningful and honest and authentic, to say, if you need anything, I'm here for you, except sometimes we don't know what we need. And so it helps to really just say, I'm coming over with food. If you're not up for company or to talk, I'm going to leave it on your doorstep. Or I'm going to say, send someone a card if you don't really feel comfortable yet, that just says, I'm thinking of you. I'm holding you in my heart. I'm holding you in my prayers. You mean a lot to me. And I think whatever can feel the most authentic to who you are and what your relationship symbolizes is going to be the most effective and meaningful form of communicating with them.
That is fantastic advice. All right, we're going to take another break and be right back with Gina Moffa, the author of the book Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go, a modern guide to navigating loss. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're talking with Gina Moffa, grief counselor and author of the book Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. And, we were talking before, you offered some fantastic advice about how to help people, what to say, what not to say to people who are grieving. Talk about people who don't grieve well. In other words, they don't go to a grief counselor like you recommended. I mean, what can happen when people suffer a loss and really don't deal with it in an appropriate way?
I think that grief is incredibly tricky, and it remains less science, more mystery, right? Because everyone will have a different relationship with the loss. So what works for me in my grief experience may really not work for someone else. And so I want to just put that out there as something to respect. I do think, though, that at some point being able to engage with our emotions or our physical experience of grief is going to be incredibly important. Because if we push it off indefinitely, right? I have a chapter where I talk about grief rhythms. And this can mean that if you, in any other difficult time of your life, have a coping mechanism, perhaps it's somebody who is a mover, somebody who likes to consistently stay busy and, always be moving, always have their calendar filled. On the outside, that may look as if you're not grieving or you're not actually dealing with your loss, quote unquote. But if that is actually the way that you cope with challenging things, that doesn't mean that you're not grieving. For many people, even if we try to escape grief, it's always a tab in the background. You're never going to forget or push away your loss indefinitely. It will come up either way, no matter what it is in your life. And so it is really just about respecting what people's coping mechanisms are normally. Everyone has a different way of dealing with hard things in their life, and grief is no different. What I will say is that if you begin to isolate, as we spoke of earlier, if you begin to self-medicate or numb or overdo it with things that are really unhealthy for you, if you're always drawing the curtains or staying in bed, these are things that are going to prolong and complicate your grief experience, and you're going to become incredibly depressed. It's going to sort of snowball into more of a mental health challenge. And so for me, I always do say that connection is key. Connection is the balm that we need, whether that's meaningful connection that you have to, religion or a specific person within your church, whether that means you reach out to a group, whether that means you reach out to a personal therapist, coach, or even your best friend. I think the key here is that no matter what, even if you don't want to, connection is going to be your key to getting through this experience and being able to bring life back in. We will never get over our losses, especially the incredibly meaningful ones. But if we can bring in a little bit of life at a time and see that life can grow around our loss, and that life can still have meaning and life can still have fulfillment and beauty a little bit at a time, not all at once and not very quickly. But if we can do that, and we do that mostly with the help of other people in our lives, then we are one step closer to being able to move through and integrate our grief. And so that is always going to be my recommendation, is connection, and even if it takes a little bit of time.
Oh, wonderful advice. All right, we're going to take one final break and be right back with grief counselor Gina Moffa. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're talking with Gina Moffa, author of the book Moving On Doesn't Mean Letting Go. And you were talking about ways to deal with a significant loss. What if the person who is no longer in your life, maybe you had a strained relationship with them? For example, let's say you had a rough divorce, Or maybe it was a family member who died and you actually were sort of estranged from them. And now you have all these strange feelings about they're gone and oh, I shouldn't have said this. How do you deal with that?
I think no matter what ending of a relationship we have, whether through death, estrangement, or simply a breakup of a short period of time, we're always going to ruminate on the what ifs, the should have, could haves, would haves of all of it. It's just a matter of not getting stuck on there. I think there's a really positive thing about being able to look at our side of the street, whether that means that we look at things that we said or could have done differently, ways that we could have left perhaps sooner, things that would bring us to a healthier way of relating both to ourselves and others. So I think definitely looking at that is important. I think getting stuck in that is a little bit hard. And so, I'm a really big proponent as well of making new routines. If you are divorcing, it can be really, the loss of routine is a really big loss that people don't speak enough about. If you're used to waking up and having coffee with your person or going on vacation, whatever the routines may be, it can be really a grief in and of itself or a secondary loss of losing those routines. So creating new routines, new traditions, new rituals is a really important step of moving forward, as well as even introducing new people, new hobbies into your life, or even getting back to old hobbies that you used to love. Staying connected to yourself and things that feel meaningful, especially in an estrangement of any kind, is a really important step in getting through it. As a mental health professional, I always say it's good if you're feeling stuck, quote unquote, in any kind of difficult emotion or rumination about the would haves and could haves of a relationship, to reach out to somebody who has an objective point of view that can help you look at it differently and perhaps in a healthier way.
All right. Well, unfortunately, Gina, we are out of time. How can our viewers learn more about you? And also, where can they get your book?
Thank you so much, Lori. You can reach me on my website, which is www.ginamoffa.com. I am also on Instagram, and I really do love giving a lot of information on grief there. It's at Gina Moffa, LCSW. And my book is sold everywhere books are sold. And I'm incredibly grateful for that and to be here with you so much. Thank you.
And we are very grateful for your time and your expertise today as well. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to you for joining us for this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next week.